Anomalies.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about things seen out of the corner of one's eye, about shadows and what lurks in those shadows. This is a program about the unexplained and the unexplainable.
So, Dave Jinks, here we are again, another episode of Anomalies. I thought we were going to be this is November. I thought by November we'd be done with the kind of theme of ghosts and ghostly encounters. But a couple of weeks ago, I was surfing the net as I usually do, and I came across a site that I wasn't really familiar with. It's a site that was sponsored by an organization called Pretty Gritty Tours. And there was an interesting guy on there, Chris Staudinger, who was talking about the haunted Washington. I said, I want to get this guy on our show. And Chris was gracious enough to respond to the email I sent him. So who's our guest? He's our guest today. So Dave, should we take a deeper dive into the world of ghostly activities and maybe make it localized to the area of the country we live in?
We should, and I, just to be clear, because I'm sure so many of us have butchered Chris's last name, I want to know how. I'm not sure how to say it. Maybe Dan got it or maybe not, but we want for people to Google his name and get to his website or websites easily.
It's a tricky one. It's Staudinger.
Is it Staudinger? Staudinger? Okay.
Yeah. My apologies if I mispronounce that.
Not a problem at all. You were closer than most. So
yeah,
I feel very proud.
I wasn't sure either, Dan. So that's why I brought that up. So Staudinger. Okay, Staudinger. Yes, got it. Staudinger.
That's the one.
Okay, and then your website or sites?
PrettyGrittyTours.com.
That's the one to go to if you're listening to the show and just have to get there. And we think you will want to visit by the end for sure. So I'll let Dan launch into it because Dan is he tends to be the ghost guy. He knows all about the entities and weird flying things and whatever. That's his domain. So go ahead, Dan, and launch into the questions here for Chris.
Maybe it's because I'm old enough to practically be a ghost. I don't know about that. So one of the questions I had as I was thinking about this show, and I looked at the Pretty Gritty Tours website. The first question I have for Chris is, how do you identify yourself? Do you identify yourself as a tour guide? Do you identify yourself as a historian? Do you identify yourself as a paranormal investigator? Well, what's your response to that, Chris?
That's a great question. Thank you for asking. I identify myself as a tour guide, and I have a background as an investigative journalist. I never, ever say that I'm a historian. I think that is a very specialized group of individual that takes their career very seriously, and I don't like to trot upon that. So I don't know that I would ever identify as a historian, but I'm an investigative journalist who's been turned into a tour guide.
Tell us about the formation of Pretty Gritty Tours.
Well, in my heyday as a journalist, my wife and I were travel journalists primarily, and so about 8 months out of the year we were on the road, usually abroad, and just got to the point where we wanted to not necessarily slow down, but have kids and change the tack of our life a little bit. And when that came around, it was like, well, we're not going to be traveling 8 months out of the year. We should probably find something a little closer to home. And it was a pretty natural transition to go from travel journalist to tour guide. It's pretty much the same skill set. It's just one, you are showcasing destinations abroad for people. The other one, you are showcasing destinations domestically for people.
I think both Dave and I can identify with the investigative part of your background, because I think both of us are kind of, why is this happening? What causes this? What's going on kind of thing. So I certainly can relate to that.
Yeah. Can you tell us what your Sorry, Dan, I jumped
No,
in.
go ahead.
You're probably going to ask the same thing. Can you tell us what you investigated before and how you kind of evolved into this realm?
I mean, I assume we're all on the same page on this because I've always just been intrigued by mysteries, by unknown things, and sort of like the origins behind them. So I really started my career tracking down places that just sounded cool. Like I would find an urban myth or a lore and track it down across the globe and then end up tracing the original story of that back to its point. And we use that as a marketing tool to get people out traveling to different destinations. And really we're doing the same here now. There's so many fascinating things in the area. And once you start pulling that thread, as you know, it only gets more interesting as you go.
Tell us about the first one of the first mysteries that you investigated that kind of drew you further down the rabbit hole.
One of the things that has always intrigued me is Post Office Bay and the Galapagos. Do you guys know much about this?
Don't at all.
Don't, no.
On one of the Galapagos Isles in the early days of like going out and charting the Pacific Ocean, they established this whiskey barrel that they set up on one of the islands to act as a post office. And then ships would come in and deposit mail into the barrel. And then as ships would come back and resupply in the Galapagos to take on water and food, they would go through the barrel and see if they had mail to be delivered back to their home country. And it was sort of an international neutral zone where even if these countries were at war or whatever, they would go and look for mail to deliver back. And the tradition has continued to the point now where if you go to the Galapagos, you can go into this barrel and look for letters addressed to where you're going back home to. And some of them have been there for years. And then you go and you deliver it by hand, which I just thought
concept
was a great tradition, a sweet story, and something that required a little more looking into.
Probably not very efficient, right, in terms of mail delivery, but certainly a great concept.
And that's actually what blew my mind. So we actually ended up doing it, and that was, oh my God, I don't know, I think 10 or 11 years ago that we were down there, and I'm still waiting on my letter. My wife got hers before we got home.
Really?
It had been delivered to her house before we had even gotten back from Ecuador. So it's hit or miss. It's like a French mail system.
Just depends on where people are headed in their travels. But yeah, that's great. Post Office Bay is what it's called.
Yeah, I'd never heard of that. That's a new one.
Yeah, it's a cool place.
But there was nothing paranormal about that particular story, right? I mean, it was just very interesting in its own right, but no ghost related.
No, I think the first sort of ghost unexplained, I mean, it's hard to track down the very first one, but I think internationally, the witches of Sikihor Island in the Philippines is one of the ones I remember covering early on. There's an island called Sikihor in the Philippines where there are two essentially clans of magic practitioners that have been around for as long as anyone can remember. And there are white magic healers that look after the people of the island. And then there are black magic, essentially witches or warlocks, depends if it's a woman or a man. And they, for money, ruin people's lives with their magic. This is the story that came down to me.
And these guys aren't politicians, right?
Nope.
The black witches, they're not politicians.
Yeah. You can buy them for considerably less.
Okay.
And does it work?
What did you find out about the dynamic of that society or those groups?
So it's interesting. We ended up doing an interview and an article on one of the white magic healers that was there on the island. The black magic ones are much more difficult to find. They actually live like in secret out in the jungles on this island because a lot of them are afraid of retaliation. Because people will actually go and hunt them down out of fear of their magic.
I could understand that. I think I would be somewhat scarce if I was practicing black magic. Are you doing, does Pretty Gritty Tours do, and I'm thinking of the pandemic here, I saw a virtual tour that you did. Are you guys doing in-person tours? And if so, what other kind of tours beside Haunted Washington are you doing?
Yeah, so we are, I guess 50-50 now. We have reopened the vast majority of our in-person tours, and those include anything from our beer tour to our candy tour to our ghost tour. We do neighborhood tours, and really everything that we do focuses on kind of telling the narrative of a place while also getting you out and engaged with what's there. You know, so if you do a beer tour, you're going to learn about how the brewers of Tacoma started by finding artesian wells in the area, but you're also going to get heavily sauced on the whole thing. We try and be inclusive on that.
I guess that's the point of the tour.
Yeah, absolutely. We cater to all tastes. But yeah, we started virtual content. We broadcast live hour-long tours on YouTube. And we started that for the pandemic. And then what I thought was going to be over, people really were attached to it. People found an opportunity to connect over it. And so we have a whole new roster. We're continuing our virtual content indefinitely.
It seems like I saw on your website that you do a virtual tour of Olympia, which is where Dave and I are at.
Yeah. I did like a cursory one of Olympia. Actually, we do walking tours in Olympia as well.
The reason that resonated with me, and this has been quite a while ago, as a matter of fact, I couldn't tell you when it was. I experimented with a ghost tour here in Olympia because I was interested in, the paranormal and the history of Olympia. So there might be, some fertile ground for you to explore in that venue if you so desire to do that. Anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that would be great.
Well, let's get into the haunted stuff. Tell us about, and you could share whatever the content of the virtual tour that I watched, or you could bring in any other haunted spot in Washington that you're familiar with, and tell us about your experiences there and kind of what you think of it, and maybe some reflections on what the hell is a haunting and why are some places haunted and some not.
Oh man, that is pretty esoteric. I'm not even sure that I'm qualified to answer that, but I'll do my best. There's so many haunted stories and areas in the sort of like Pierce County, King County, Thurston County, Golden Triangle, as I call it. But the one that keeps drawing me back, that has been the reflection of most of our tours here in Tacoma, is the story of the Andalana, which is a 300-foot cargo ship that disappeared in 1899. And the first I'd ever heard about it was that this ship had come to anchor in Tacoma. It was January 1899, and there were 16 sailors on board the ship in the middle of the night. And when people woke up the next morning, it had completely vanished, and they had no idea where it went. And the popular theory was that they had unloaded all their cargo the night before, and they were going to take on new cargo the next day. So the ship was riding high, and when a windstorm came through that night, it just flipped over. That one of the ballast logs they had chained to the side had somehow come undone, and the ship turned over, and it disappeared into the commencement bay, and everyone drowned. But just as a journalist going through the documentation on that, things were weird, because even the newspaper articles from the time couldn't agree on when the ship had disappeared, like to the day, or on how many people had been on board, and none of the information really matched up. So I started just looking deeper into that, and then that opened up a whole Pandora's box of unanswered questions about how this ship had a reputation for being cursed for a decade, how people had been disappearing or getting murdered on it from the moment it had set sail. The captain was locking people up at night to prevent them from escaping the ship. It got crazier and crazier and crazier, to the point where by the time I was done with it, I was like, well, we have to do something with this. The whole story is literally haunting.
So how do you spell the ship name?
It's Andalana, Andelana.
Andalana. Okay. Wow. What does that? Did you find out what that word means, or what the origin of that word is?
I think
interesting.
The best information I have is that it was just named after a woman. The shipping company that commissioned the Andalana had several of this class of ship, and they all had A names. But yeah, it was the one that had the most rocky history.
Well, it's just an unusual name. I wondered if there was any significance to the name, for any reason. If when executive named it after a missing daughter or something strange like that, it could play into the whole thing.
That is a really good tack on it. I'm actually curious about that myself now.
I mean, you'd have to accept that maybe there was some fate that was being determined by having been named that, or there were other factors going on. But sometimes, like you said, when you get into something that gets weirder and weirder, you start to think maybe this thing was cursed from the beginning because of some decision or somebody's angst, that led to, whatever the events were that followed. So I'm always interested I'm a word person anyway. So I need to know the names of things and the history of the names. And that's, like you said, a different tack you can take, but that's certainly 1899. Is there information? Can you Google it and find much about it, or where did you have to dig to find this stuff?
Yes and yes. There's a significant amount of information about the Andalana, and you have to be careful with it because, like I said, a lot of it was misinformation or mistreated information that then sort of got parroted over time.
Mm-hmm.
I hit a lucky strike in that there is a maritime museum in Europe right now that has documentation, letters, and logs from the last year that the Andalana was at sea. And it took me a long time to find them because they were in French, and so they weren't popping up on any sort of Google search. But working with the Maritime History Museum here in Tacoma, we ended up uncovering them, and that's where the weirdness really started to jump out at me. Because going back to your theory on the origin of it, the very first year that the Andalana took out to sea, it had this entirely Japanese crew with an English captain, and two of these Japanese sailors die in a storm. One of them falls overboard and drowns, and the captain lists that as his reason for resigning his commission and quitting the life at sea. The other sailor fell out of the rigging but landed on deck and broke his back, and for several days was on board the ship before he died. And the captain, for unknown reasons, refused to let the sailors have a funeral for him. And so the Japanese sailors had this belief that if you don't honor a spirit on the night of their death, that it starts to stick to the ship and will actually cause it to sink at some point. And the Shinto tradition is that you need to give final rites on these marked anniversaries. And one of them is on the 7-year anniversary. And in fact, the Andalana vanishes into Commencement Bay on the exact 7-year anniversary from that sailor's death.
So has there been any attempt, and I'm thinking about divers, to go down into Commencement Bay and find the remains of the ship?
This is one of the crazy parts. Yes, there have been 152 documented recovery attempts, and only 3 have ever seen it. The Andalana has never been in the same location that it was recorded as being.
Really?
And each time a diver has gone to either recover it intentionally or has accidentally stumbled across it, they've died.
How do you know they? So 3 claimed to have stumbled or showed. I mean, how do you know that they found something?
So the first diver was on contract for the railroad in town. He dives down 2 days after the Andalana vanishes, and they are attempting to recover the ship. They want to bring it back up and just reuse it. And they put tugboat hooks on the side of it, and these 4 tugboats try and drag it up, and all the lines break. The diver goes back down to reset them, and the pressurizing pump that's up on deck just pops a seal. randomly. They never found any reason for it to happen. Pops a seal, and at 152 feet down, this guy's actually sucked inside his helmet and crushed to death.
Oh my God.
Jeez. That suggests curse, doesn't it?
It was kind of like, you're like, okay, maybe. One, you're like, okay. The second time a diver finds it, he's looking for anchors, lost anchors down on the bottom of Commencement Bay that they're going to reuse, and stumbles across this ship and brings a railing up from the side of it. And people are like, based on what we're seeing right here, we're pretty sure this is this ship that disappeared, the Andalana. So he goes back down to recover the rest of it or any other piece to sort of confirm the identity, dies mysteriously at the bottom of Commencement Bay.
Oh my gosh.
Equipment failure.
So when were these dives then?
First one would have been in 1899. The second one was in the 1920s. And then the last time that anybody saw it was a diver that brought up a port light, sort of like a little skylight from the side of the ship, which has its own weird history to it that we can talk about. But that diver ends up drowning as well.
I can tell that Chris is a kindred spirit, Dave, because he's drawn into all these weird things like we are.
Well, at some point, it becomes just an exercise in statistics, you know? Like Chris said, one time, okay, maybe it's a fluke. 2 times, you start to get suspicious. 3 times, you're like, there's another variable here that we're missing, that we don't understand. And then when it goes beyond that, it makes an impression on me is that even in this day and age of record keeping and hard drives and whatever, all these different ways to preserve the past, if you go back just 120 years, you realize how much of a different era it was and how things can get lost over just a mere century. Right. And sometimes the story goes away for forever unless you have people like Chris who's digging at all, tugging at all the different threads and hoping to find something and preserve these stories and these accounts. And it shows how fragile I think humanity is, and our history can get lost in a matter of decades, if somebody isn't pursuing it.
And you make such a valid point, because just like trying to keep it straight, is difficult at times. So I think the integrity of the information is always important.
Yeah. And if there's one guy or a couple guys, such as you, yourself, or if you die or give up on the story and let it languish somewhere, it potentially just disappears for forever unless you've handed it off to somebody else, which is, at the same time, it's amazing to think that we have any history at all beyond, 100 years ago. We go back thousands of years into the past, but it also illustrates how easy it is to get to have the past, misconstrued purposely or not. As you said, that you had to weed through a lot of misinformation just to get this story straight in your own mind. And speaking of that, so do you have an account of it somewhere that people can read? Did you kind of compile this, or is this just a
yeah? I mean, well, I obviously have a vested interest in the retelling of the story, but yeah, I haven't published it anywhere other than the verbal retellings of it or the ghost tour itself. But yeah, between the Maritime Seaport and myself, we have a massive hard drive now of just documentation, accounts, photography. It's so. Yeah. Let me give you another example of just how weird this is, right?
Sure.
So there's one survivor from the Andalana, and we know about him because one of the guys who took the best notes on board the ship, they were buddies. And when they were in Shanghai, the last port before they came to Tacoma, one of them, this guy named Richard, went to a Chinese mystic fortune teller and told him about the curse. And the guy sold him a little magic talisman. It looks like a coin without the middle. And he's like, as long as you have this on you, you'll be fine. It protects people from dying at sea. And they sail to Tacoma. Richard is on board the ship when the Andalana disappears. But his friend, Percy, is on shore. The captain sent one guy to come ashore and give apologies for the captain, saying that he wasn't going to come ashore that night. He's going to stay on board the ship and take care of things. And then Percy ends up getting sick and taken to the hospital and wakes up the next morning the Andalana is gone. And in the pocket of his jacket is that talisman.
Oh, gosh.
When he was leaving the ship, they think he accidentally grabbed Richard's jacket and just happened to have this magic token on him.
Wow.
Which it's insane to me.
Well, it's great. I mean, it's a great story, if you never have a conclusion that's satisfying, when you've got so many different pieces and human, interest stories in there and different characters, that by itself, well, is great for what you're doing. I mean, you're giving tours and painting a picture of the past. And most of these things don't have a, satisfying resolution, it seems like, scientifically at least, but it's fun to ponder.
Yeah.
One of the things go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no. After you, I insist.
Okay. One of the things that I'm drawn into here is the ability to tell stories and make history come alive. And I think history, and Dave is kind of hinting at this a little bit, history is just something that happened in the past and is irrelevant. And I think this story is highly relevant and maybe says a lot about, what I'm intrigued by reality, what's real and what isn't real. And this gets right at the core of that story. So I really appreciate this story about this ship. Let's move, though, if we could. Let's move out of Commencement Bay and go someplace else. There are a couple of stories on your video that I was intrigued by, and there's some cemeteries out there that aren't in Tacoma. Take us to some other haunted spot in Washington that you find intriguing.
I always tell people that one of my absolute favorite places is Bucota, which is not too far from you guys down there in Olympia.
I don't think I've been there, but I recognize the name. I know it's around here. I couldn't point the direction where it is. Dan, have you been there before?
Well, I have, but what I'm thinking about is every Halloween they change the name of the town to, it's spelled Bucoda, but they make it Boo. Bucota, and everything is Halloween oriented. As a fan of Halloween, I'm just very intrigued by that. But I think there's some other depth to that story and what's going on down there that I think Chris could share with us.
Absolutely. Yeah, not only did they save their town through official proclamation of renaming it to Bucota every October, but the history of the area runs incredibly deep. It was Washington Territory's first penitentiary.
I thought so, yeah.
They built a massive wooden blockhouse out there and hired a private firm essentially to take care of prisoners for the territory before we were a state. And a lot of them died inside that facility, and they sort of just had a mass grave a little bit closer to where the Tenino Cemetery is today, which that area, it's a park now. The penitentiary has since burned down, but it has just a dark vibe to it even today. And before that, the original area was known as Siatko, which is named after a Nisqually legend that there are these creatures that live out there that essentially wait until winter and eat people.
All right. Are we kind of talking about Bigfoot on one level? Because that's how I heard Siatko first explained about the connection to Bucota.
There's some like cross pollination. I think you've got a lot of Bigfoot lore that gets swept up into it. There's the stick people, which are, based on what I've heard, used to be humans who turned to cannibalism in the winter and have been since cursed, and now they wander around the woods just murdering people. And then there's the Siatko, which I think literally translates to like ghost place or haunted place, which I think are something entirely different, somewhere in that zone of cautionary tale / cryptozoology / just stay out of the woods. But there's definitely, I mean, since time immemorial, something has been in that area that has kept people away. It was one of the few areas that when people were coming out to the Washington Territory and settling it, There weren't already people there. It was an empty space.
It looks like it's due. I just brought up the map here. It's pretty much due south of us. It's not that far away either. It looks like it's maybe 30 miles. It's by Tenino. So you've been there, Dan, you said?
Yeah, I used to volunteer at Wolf Haven, which is out that way.
Oh, is that where Wolf Haven is? Oh.
Well, it's by Tenino.
That's right.
Closer to Tenino. So that's how I think I ran across Bucota. Yeah, I did hear the stories about the prison, though, the territorial prison. Do you have any good ghost stories relative to that, Chris?
To the prison itself, there have been a few good ones that people have seen. There was a woman who lived on the property, and she was a prisoner there, but she got to live in a separate sort of like outbuilding because she was still raising her kids, and she ends up dying there, based on what I can learn. And people say that they'll still see her out there because there's the Skookumchuck River runs at the back of the park where the territorial penitentiary used to be. And people all the time have had accounts of seeing this woman just standing down there in the dark, that sometimes it looks like she's washing clothes, or that she'll just come up from the river and then disappear as she's supposed to get close to you. For me, there have been multiple times where we've gone out there, we've done tours, we've done recordings, and there is a sound. There's a sound, this undescribable, inhuman like scream that has been heard multiple times out there. And I've got recordings of it. I have no idea what it is, but in that little patch of forest at the back of where the prison is, every now and then it's just this like gut destroying, high pitched, shrill scream that comes through the night.
So as an old ghost hunter, the minute I hear that, I'm drawn into the EVP, electronic voice phenomena range. So is that scream you're talking about something that's picked up on recording devices, or is that audible to the human ear?
Both.
Without both. Oh.
Yeah. I think on our virtual tour of Bucota, we actually have a recording of it that you can hear.
Do you do a lot of EVP stuff when you do ghost tours?
Yeah, we've done it in a few places. The Stillicum Ore House, we had some good content from, and Stadium High School have both turned out really good results on that.
Well, there's just a wealth of all this weirdness out there if people look for it, you know.
Yeah, and
go ahead, Dave.
I just want to get Chris's opinion on. So we've interviewed quite a few people on the subject of ghosts and psi and paranormal phenomena in general. Barry Taff. I don't know who else. We had a ghost. Lloyd
Arbach and
and
Ross Allison from the
Ghost. Ross Allison. And so I think one of our tasks, maybe an impossible one, is to try to tie some of these things together and find some commonality between these phenomena, these experiences, these accounts, these reports, that investigative reporters and authors are compiling here. And one of the themes that runs through it all is an intensity of emotion seems to be where some of these things arise, and so you mentioned a prison, of course. Prisons, Western State Hospital, is one of Dan's favorite things to bring up because he envisions himself in it, I think, is the he says, maybe I should be there.
Dave, you're not supposed to bring up those kind of references.
I'm really picking on Dan tonight. I don't know what my problem is. But the point is that these places and he just visited Gettysburg too, looking at battlefields and of course the proverbial Indian burial ground and the house where the daughter was murdered, all sorts of things like that. But this intensity of emotion, do you think, Chris, that you see a thread that connects emotion with these sorts of, quote, haunted places or these haunted, haunting incidents? Does it make sense to connect those two things in your experience?
Yeah, I think you end up finding events like this in places where there's unresolved narrative. I think where there's stories that are left untold, you find this wellspring of haunted activity.
Yeah, and that's a different perspective on it that I had not really thought of. Unresolved, of course, that usually goes with emotions that are frustration and angst and different types of feelings, that hopelessness, those sorts of things, desperation, fear, of course. But it's not just about fear. It is, yeah. I mean, that's a really good point. It's a missing resolution or unfinished business, so to speak. So you see that generally in these haunted places, or is it just the fact that exists all over through human experience? You're gonna hit on one of them. If you look hard enough.
It is hard to sift through everything, right? But it may just be that's what I'm drawn to. So I find myself in those spots. But I'm a firm believer that where you have a lack of resolution, you have ghosts. I just think where something's left undone, it happens. Because, tragedy happens all the time. There's always sadness and loss. But it seems to be in places where that is unbalanced, where there's a perpetration that is done, and one side is left unresolved, unspoken, unremembered.
That is,
you get something that lingers.
Yeah, that's a great perspective, because it implies a lack of balance in the universe. It appears tries to seek balance rather than chaos, or I guess we have entropy. I don't know how you categorize that. That's a form of balance. It's evening out charges, and you get into physics and all that, but even in human emotion, you're evening out. We have this innate desire to have things fair, eye for an eye. Things are fair, and things that are not fair, such as a young child being abducted or killed, or an unfair fight, or imprisonment, unjust, stuff like that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That's a good perspective. But I'll stop talking here. Let Dan, because Dan's got some great questions for you, I'm sure. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, Dave, I think your questions and insights are really great too.
I know, but I just tend to get all philosophical and go into my own head and forget that I'm in an interview. Where
that's okay.
You're better at remembering and coming up with the really good probing questions. So go ahead.
Well, one thing I'm kind of interested in that Chris and you were talking about, and I'm thinking about Lon Strickler, our guest back in Pennsylvania, who at 8-9 went on to Gettysburg battlefield and saw the battle and smelled the battle and heard the battle. Now, I was probably in some of the same places he was at, and I didn't see a damn thing. So one thing that's interesting to me is not only why certain things happen in terms of, are there instances of great emotion or turmoil that somehow imprint certain things on the environment, but the other part of that is, who can have access to that? Do you have to be tuned into that? Or, because like I said, nothing happened to me while I was on that battlefield, but other people talk about how some of the just extraordinary life experiences where they literally get to relive the Civil War. So that's intriguing. That's intriguing to me. It's not really, it's kind of an aside to our conversation here a little bit. So I don't know if you have a perspective on that or want to.
Oh man, I didn't realize we were going to get so deep on this today, but
well, that's what we do. That's the fun part.
I do have this, and I guess since you gave me the entry, it would be rude of me not to walk through the door.
Go ahead.
I'm going to do my best to make it concise and not unravel my whole existence so quickly. But I read this book. I don't know if you guys have read it, about this tiger in Russia. Okay. Long story short, in this book about a tiger in Russia, which I highly recommend, I think it's called The Tiger. There are some cultural anthropologists who talk about the descent, or this great moment where mankind essentially comes down out of the trees and starts living in the world of terror where we're hunted by things. And that in that moment, we are bonded in our fears. That, like, their example was that you can take a child from anywhere in the world and give them toys of like a zebra and a tiger or whatever. And even if they've never seen those animals, if they have no knowledge of them, they know instinctively that one chases and kills the other. And so I think, and I don't know why, we come coded from our creation with this collective, I don't know, set of things that we can intuit and feel and know. And I think the ghost experience is a big part of that. There are just things that we pick up on without even being aware of it. And I think those areas of injustice trigger those moments, if this makes any sense at all.
Mm-hmm.
I just think it's like how people are afraid of spiders. Even if you have no reason, no life experience in your existence to be afraid of a spider, it's just something where you're like, that is bad. And I think we intuit those moments in the world around us. And I think some people are more open to picking up on that. So if you walk through battlefields or old penitentiaries or places that have been marked in some invisible way by that injustice, you can sense it. That's my 2 cents on that.
That's great. And my first thought is that you can approach it from a dry kind of, Darwinian evolutionary perspective, saying, well, of course we've evolved to dislike spiders because one person got bitten by a black widow and blah, blah, blah. But I think it comes to like the concept of archetypes and just innate knowledge. Maybe it stems from a distant human, a collective human consciousness or a past. I think it's much more interesting than just the strictly evolutionary perspective, because I don't think that explains a whole lot of stuff. I mean, at a very basic level, maybe, yeah, it makes sense. We're scared of tigers because they ate my grandfather or something. But I mean, there's something deeper and more intrinsic and innate. So yeah, that's a great thing to bring up. I totally agree with Chris on that. There's something fundamental that maybe we've lost touch with, and it just kind of bubbles up to the surface in certain situations, more so with certain people too. Unfortunately, I'm kind of like Dan, or maybe fortunately, I don't have ghosts coming into my house. I don't have aliens abducting me. I don't have hallucinations on the battlefield or whatever, but at some point you kind of wish you would have, at least Dan and I wish we would have personal experiences rather than always having to get the report from another person who's lived it. And so that brings me to one of my most important questions for Chris, and that is, have you had personal experiences that you'd like to share, just having been involved in all these sorts of investigations with paranormal type things? What have you experienced yourself that you'd like to share?
Question. Yeah, I want to hear that too. If you want to share.
Yeah, I scooped Dan on that because that's always one of his questions. But we just wanted to see if you've had anything you want to share that fits into that category, at least loosely.
Well, as you know, as an objective reporter, I always try and be as clear as possible and use my experiences to report back as honestly as I can. Mm-hmm. And the first one that jumps to mind for me is we used to do exploration like young when we were in college, just going out into the woods at a place called Clay City, which used to be, as the name implies, a brick making town, essentially just south of like Puyallup, kind of out by Kapowsin, way out in the sticks. And they don't produce brick there anymore. The whole place has been destroyed and left in ruins. And it's now part of a timber claim, as well as sort of like a wildlife reclamation area. But we used to go out there all the time looking for this mythic house that's out there, a little brick house that's the only remaining part of Clay City. And every time you go out there, I've never had an experience going out there where, like, if you don't stop for gas or something, there's always someone who's like, "What are you doing?" You're like, "Going to Clay City." And they're like, bad idea.
Don't go there, huh?
Bad stuff happens out there. And every time I've ever gone, there is a sound. And it is not quite an animal sound, not quite a machine sound. It's something like if a bear had a stomach ache but was also riding an ATV in the distance.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
That's hard to picture.
It's hard to describe, but
Yeah.
it's a terrifying sound, and it only happens if someone in the group is scared.
So that fear triggers it somehow.
Yeah, and that's been the thing, because I've taken groups out there over the years, and like you'll be going around in the dark, it's no big deal, and nothing, but like someone will step on a stick or get spooked or something, sound. And it's always at a distance behind you. Like it's not something that you ever get farther away from or closer to. It kind of just follows along behind you as you go deeper into the woods. I've been out there day and night, heard the sound both times. I've never seen anything that could cause it. You know, it's not a distant road sound. There isn't a generator out there. There's no structures nearby. It's completely unexplainable to me, but I know that the only thing I've noticed is that if people are scared, it's there, and if they're not, it's not.
And Clay City, is Clay City on the map somewhere, or do you just have to know where it is?
You have to know where it is. There's Clay City Road. You can go out, if you can go out on Google Maps and you look for Kapowsin, and then you'll see like a little lake on the map. I can give you, here's the instructions that were first given to me. You go south on Meridian till you see a Shell station with bars on the windows, and you go left.
Okay.
Until you come to the Devil's Blinking Eyes, which is a 4-way stop that has the like red flashing lights. At the Devil's Eyes, you go right, and then you'll see the Clay City sign down into the fog. And you follow that up to a yellow security gate that's just painted with all sorts of like satanic stuff, like handprints all over it. People go out there knowing what to expect. And that's it. That's Clay City. You follow the road out there, and it is horrifying.
Wow.
Well, someday after I retire, Dan's already retired. I'm hoping to some near year, but I'm making a list of all these places I want to take Dan. Dan and I drive out somewhere and just see if we can experience something ourselves. You know, or take a tour. And Chris,
take a tour.
That might be even better. Might be easier. We wouldn't get as lost that way, I bet.
Well, one place that Chris has got me interested in, and I shared this with Michelle, a friend of mine, is the cemetery at Black Diamond. Now, is that a place I might want to go, because there are some similar things going on out there that you're talking about, things that are there sometimes but not other times? Talk a little bit about that cemetery. I think that's an interesting story.
The cemetery at Black Diamond is one of the most consistently investigated and then confirmed places where people have seen echoes, ghosts, parts of the past, and unaffiliated groups have seen similar things, like groups of miners walking through the area, or of a white horse, a really aggressive white horse that comes into the cemetery at night and will stand next to people, like charge them a little bit, but then not be there. Like if it looks like it's about to run into you, it's gone. And it's similar for me with Black Diamond. I've never seen anything, but I've heard a horse out there in the cemetery, which is very strange. Black Diamond Cemetery and Wilkeston, Washington are two of the just like you can feel it in the air, genuinely spooky places out there.
Where is Black Diamond?
Kind of in that patch between the like SeaTac area and the crest of the Cascades. You sort of go out past Auburn, out in the Enumclaw, Auburn.
Okay.
Oh, it really is right on the, right. I'm looking at the map here, kind of right as it turns into mountainous tree forest. I mean, forest for hundreds of miles. It looks like it's right on the outskirts.
Yeah, it's out there.
Ravensdale and
home of Brandy Carlisle.
Ravensdale?
Yep.
Yeah. Well, what about what is it? Roswell.
Oh, Roslyn.
Roslyn.
Not Roswell, but did you go out there at all?
To the home of the world's longest free-flowing spittoon. Yeah, I've been out to Roslyn.
I guess.
It's a factoid I didn't know about as far as Roslyn is concerned.
Yeah, the saloon out there, the Brick, which has multiple ghost sightings. The old town jailhouse in the bottom of that building still, which, depending on who's bartending, you can take a tour of it, and it's really cool down there. But yeah, also the world's longest free-flowing spittoon that they do the spittoon boat races in annually. More you know, my friends.
Wow.
Yeah. Let's go back to Black Diamond. I'm trying to remember what you said on your virtual tour. Is there also some kind of shack where some guy comes out of that shack at night, but the shack's not there during the day, or am I hallucinating that part of the story?
I think you are perhaps considering Melmont.
Oh, okay. I'm confusing those two.
A lot of those old mining communities that disappeared after the coal did, all those structures were left out there. And Melmont, I believe, is the one that I heard. There's an old shack out there, and I'm trying to remember if I've got it. I think it's the right one, or it could be Bordeaux. Man, I know which one you're talking about. It's either Bordeaux or Melmont, but there was an old inspector's house, essentially, and he was responsible for a lot of the quality control in that coal mining community, and someone tried to assassinate him by blowing up the house.
Boy.
Wow.
And they put dynamite underneath it, but the attempt went sideways. They end up catching the guys, but people will see that structure there sometimes. Like, they'll go down to explore it and they'll see this house, and the guy runs out, tells them that they're not allowed to be down there, and if they scamper away afterwards and then come back, it's not there. The foundation of it will still be there, but the house isn't. And every time people see it, it always looks like it's just been plucked out of the timeline and put back there.
Oh, you mentioned Bordeaux. I used to belong to a ghost hunting group here in Olympia, and we actually went to Bordeaux because that's not too far south, and it's kind of like you're describing. It's a community that once was thriving, but today is nothing but a bunch of abandoned buildings. But that's an interesting vibe to it too.
Yeah, I think a lot of those ones are just great for exploration because of the stories and the ghosts left behind. Because a lot of the foundations, right, are still there, but intensely dangerous in a lot of ways, with the old coal mines left out there.
One of the other stories that I was kind of fascinated about, it seemed like, was, well, two. One involved one of my favorite places, which is Lake Crescent in the Olympic National Park. And then the other would be the old Tacoma City Hall. Do you want to talk a little bit about either of those?
I'd be happy to. Lake Crescent is just a deeply unsettling story. They have a bend there where it used to just be so treacherous because cars would fly off the side of it all the time. And the majority of those vehicles are still at the bottom of the lake. And because of the mineral content and the temperature, it's remarkably clear water. And you can see dive footage of people going down and looking at a lot of those cars down there where people were inside and drowned. And it became such a common thing. But the story that first intrigued me about the lake was of a woman. They kept seeing a woman just under the surface of the water, or like people would go swimming and think they saw something under the water, and it would look like there's a woman down there, but then she wouldn't be there. And I'm going to get my years wrong here, but I think it was in the like 30s or 40s, they found a woman floating on the surface of the lake. And initial investigation found that her flesh was like soap, like you could scoop it away. And so they weren't sure what was going on, if it was like a trick or something. They end up confirming her identity through dental records, that it was a woman who had been murdered by her husband and then bound and chained and sent to the bottom of Lake Crescent, which is remarkably deep. And while she was down there, it's called saponification. The mineral content of the lake turned the fat in her body into soap, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so as she became more buoyant, her remains floated back to the surface, and they discovered the resolution to this cold case. They ended up arresting the guy and convicting him of the murder of his wife. But that story alone is enough to haunt people. But the fact that it happened and that people had been seeing it both before and after was something that really intrigued me about it.
Now, isn't that where that woman is seen? Don't they refer to that area as the Devil's Punch Bowl? Am I getting that correct? Or maybe
I think that's correct. I think it's Ambulance Point is where the cars went off, and then the Devil's Punch Bowl, which I always think of the one in Oregon, but I think that is the name for the Lake Crescent one as well.
Ambulance Point is what they called it,
because an ambulance flew off.
Oh, I thought maybe because they just always had an ambulance on.
Just always going to fish people out.
Oh, well, that's even worse, though.
Yeah, I think it got to that was the turning point. Like people were going off the corner all the time, and then at one point they had an ambulance that was coming around and just hit the corner wrong, and everyone went down. Yikes!
Jeez. There's some more tragedy.
Or just buckets of tragedy.
Well, I have two places that may or may not have anything interesting in them, other than the is it the Mima Mounds or the Mima Mounds? I don't know how to pronounce it. And then there's also a sort of a Stonehenge somewhere to the south of us, isn't there? Dan, did you go to that?
Are you talking? Yeah, I think there's something by Goldendale. Is that what you're talking about, Dave?
I don't know. There's a Stonehenge or a henge.
Yeah, I think I've heard about.
I've always thought I should go there. I mean, it's not close; it's an hour or two or something away from us. But then the mounds too, which have had many different, many attempts to explain them scientifically. I don't know if there's been some sort of resolution, to use that word, in terms of what causes them. But I just wonder if Chris had any, stories or knowledge of those places.
I do, believe it or not.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah, I did a virtual tour on the Mima Mounds. And yeah, there's still, endless speculation about those, because you've got these relatively uniform mounds that just exist out there on this huge stretch of land, right? Mm-hmm. The current most accepted theory, believe it or not, is gophers.
Yeah, that's what I read fairly recently.
Generations of gophers.
Sure. Well,
and that's I've
maybe
looked into it. That's their big thing. There's a lot of other really good theories on it, about glacial recession, seismic activity, a lot of paranormal experiences. I know that people used to think that they were burial mounds for a long time. Mm-hmm. But a lot of the early expeditions to the area were like, let's figure it out. So they just cracked them open, but they were not. None of them are occupied by anything but gophers. So yeah. It's a compelling argument. It's a long one, so I'll spare you for now. But the whole thousands of years of gophers readjusting their homes so that they don't flood is currently what people are working with.
I think I did read that, and it did make a lot of sense. It's just why there and why, I don't know. It's not as interesting as the alternatives, but it may be the actual explanation. What about the Stonehenge? You know what I'm referring to? I don't know where it is.
If it's out by Marysville, I think, if it's the one I'm thinking of, sort of southern Washington.
Well, that's north. Oh, wait, Marysville? Isn't that?
Yeah, that's north of Seattle.
That's way up by Canada, is almost.
Wait, hold on. Maybe I know I'm thinking of the one you are, sort of down by the Columbia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or wait, Mary Hill?
Maybe it's something else. Yeah. Yeah. I could Google it. I just wondered if you had been there.
I have. Because I was like, why is there a Stonehenge in Washington?
Yeah.
It was built by a guy who believed that the British Stonehenge was a tribute or a monument to a war god. So he built an exact replica of Stonehenge here in Washington State as a veterans tribute, because he thought it was like another war memorial type experience. So, and it's perfectly lined up. It hits the same dimensions and lines up with the cosmos the way that the UK one does. But yeah, it was just a passion project for a guy who didn't have enough Google research to find out what Stonehenge was going on for. So I love that story.
Yeah, that's great that he could do that. How did he move the stones, though? Was there?
I'm trying to remember. I'm pretty sure he had the aid of steam-powered equipment, if not something diesel-powered by that point, because I can't remember the exact year that they went in. It's later than you'd expect, but not so recent that it would have been easy.
Huh, cool. There's a lot of cool stuff in our state. So
Hey.
the one last question I wanted to get, and I know we're a little over an hour here. Dan is kind of the timekeeper. He keeps us on track too. And the question I have, you kind of alluded to it when you said an echo. You called the vision or the appearance of some sort of apparition. You called it an echo, which implies to me that you might think, or at least your working model is that at least some ghosts or some of these apparitions are imprints or, well, echoes, for lack of a better word, I guess, of what though, and where do they reside, and do they include any human, any human spirit or anything living? I mean, what's your model on what ghosts are in general?
Yeah, wow, you guys are giving me all the hard ones today. But
well, I know you have an opinion on it. I wouldn't ask if I didn't know you had. If I didn't think you had an opinion. I
have a working hypothesis, I guess, because my deep love of investigative research. But I think an echo is exactly what I think. I don't think that any of the paranormal activity or ghost experiences out there are imaginative or inventive or even like sentient, maybe. I think it's just a ghost signal, an echo. It's like if you've heard a radio broadcast in space. I think it's every now and then when something happens that echo, that signal just continues to linger, to broadcast longer. Because I do think that there's an unresolution. There's something that needs to be encountered before it can stop.
And so where does that echo originate? Is it, we kind of touched on earlier about certain people are sensitive to the echo, or can a person create an echo, or are you just accessing it in the Akashic record or something? It exists already in the matrix and they're checking it out of the library, like you check out a library book, intentionally or not. And some people just have they have a more valid library card. for those of us who remember library cards,
yeah.
Some of our audience maybe go to library. What
the hell is that?
What's a library? Who checks it out? Who checks the book out? Who checks the recording out, and what triggers it? Obviously, those are the even deeper questions. But you're saying that these kind of exist in a matrix already for some reason. How did they get imprinted in the matrix? I guess that goes to the question of, is it intensity of emotion that imprints it there, or like you said, a lack of a resolution that causes it to remain?
You ever have in your social group a moment where something happens and inevitably there's someone in the group who's like, you know what, let's regroup, let's think this through. I don't know if we need to do anything. And then there's someone in the group who's like, I'm gonna say something right now.
Okay.
I think those people become ghosts. I think when there is something that in their life or in their death or whatever that they feel needs to be communicated to share beyond, I think that's where your echoes come from. I don't know what the toolkit is for creating that, but I think that's where it happens. I think just in the stories that I've encountered, it seems to have been people that would have spoken up who end up coming back as ghosts or echoing.
Yeah, no, that's certainly does seem, some ghosts seem to be very insistent and even a little immature or something. A little, I need to be heard. So you're saying,
yeah, there's just something where they're like, no, we're gonna keep bringing this up.
Yeah,
that's why there's so few Norwegian Lutheran ghosts. We're all just like, it's fine.
It's I don't know. Yeah, that's That's not where I thought the conversation would go, but here we are. It's an interesting, approach.
It's a working hypothesis. Like I said, we'll see.
Well, I want to thank Chris for taking the time today to visit with us. This is about everything I hoped it would be, kind of the way the conversation went. And Dave was a part of this, but I just did a ghost presentation at a library on Halloween, and we had a question and answer period. But the problem with doing something like that is you have to admit, do you really know the answer to some of this stuff? You can ask the questions, but the answers seem to be somewhat elusive. But Chris, I want to thank you for giving freely of your time. If somebody wants to take a pretty gritty tour, the in-person tours, so what's the cost to do that in case people are interested in doing either virtual or in-person tours?
Our in-person tours average about $20, a little more for the ones that include alcohol. And our online content is always free. Cool. All of our live broadcasts are free of charge.
Cool. Well, Dave, do you have any final thoughts or words for Chris?
No, not really. I just want to thank you for being able to walk the line between, fun, because some of the stuff is fun. It's exciting. It's everyday life can be a bit mundane. So every once in a while you want to just be excited or scared or whatever. So you kind of walk the line between entertainment, but also there's clearly an element of serious research and investigative journalism and so on. So sometimes it's not easy to walk that line. You either go one way or the other. You're a stuffy scientist, or you're just an entertainer or a charlatan. We see lots of charlatans in these areas too, but I like your approach, being open-minded and appreciating the fun side of it too. So that, I don't really have any other questions. We could go on for hours, I'm sure, getting deeper and deeper into these issues, because they go on forever and you never resolve them, which is why we keep having shows. Keep trying to get answers, and the more we get into it, the fewer answers we really have. But that's it for me. I'd like to say thanks to Chris. I do appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.
And people can just go to prettygrittytours.com and see what tours are available. And do you design a specific tour? If somebody said, I want a tour of just the cemeteries of Western Washington, is that something you could cook up if you don't have a template for that already?
Oh, absolutely. Custom tours are a specialty. I've got all this information, so it's got to go somewhere. It'd be great.
Go somewhere. Okay.
And are you in Seattle, or
I'm Tacoma based?
Oh, Tacoma. Okay, based in Tacoma, but you go north and south, and east and west. It sounds like.
I do. I consider all of Washington State fair game. So.
Well, maybe we'll see you on a tour sometime, Chris.
That'd be great. Just let me know.
Okay, cool. Thanks again for being on the program.
My pleasure, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Chris.